Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this ESCO seminar on depletion and degradation. I suppose I should say good afternoon, technically, since we're now a few seconds past 12 o'clock. We're lucky enough today to have a report on some important work OMS has been doing on measuring depletion and degradation in the context of the natural capital accounts. Given the greater emphasis nowadays on net concepts as well as gross concepts, that's a really important piece of work in my view, so I'm really looking forward to what Aram's going to say. Aram Hawa will talk for about 35 minutes. Then Rachel Solovicek will produce her discussion points and spend about 10 minutes or so on that. Rachel's a very old friend of ESCO, so delighted to have her with us. And then we'll have 15 minutes or so for questions and answers. There is a Q&A facility, so if you have questions as we're going through the presentations, please record them and we'll try and get through as many as we can. But I think that's probably enough to introduce the session. And so, Aram, over to you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Joe. I'll just pop my screen up. Lovely. Joe, can you just confirm that you can see that?
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, I'll kick off now. So, hello, everyone. Yeah, as Joe said, my name is Aram Hawa, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. I work at the UK's Office for National Statistics in the Natural Capital Accounting team. 2 weeks ago, we released a new statistical article called Developing Estimates of Depletion for the UK Natural Capital Accounts, and I've dropped a link to this in this slide. To mention at the start, although the name of this webinar is Depletion and Degradation in the UK Natural Capital Accounts, I will be focusing primarily on depletion because the methods devised in the time available meant we could only produce physical and monetary estimates of depletion, and so only a limited discussion of degradation is provided. At the time of submitting the abstract to ESCO, we were very much in an exploratory phase of this work. However, in this presentation, I will go through the rationale for developing depletion accounts, including some of the theory, before moving on to how we applied SEEA, or the System of Environmental Economic Accounting methods, to our data sources. Then finally, presenting our results. So a good place to start is with defining depletion. And according to SEEA, depletion in physical terms is the decrease in the quantity of the stock of a natural resource that is due to extraction occurring at a level greater than that of regeneration. This definition encompasses both renewables and non-renewable natural resources. Non-renewables are a limiting case where rates of regeneration are zero, at least across human relevant time spans, in which case depletion simply equates to the physical volume of the stocks removed in an accounting period. Examples of this include the extraction of oil, gas, and coal reserves. Renewables are complicated by the fact that stocks do replenish over time, such as fish and timber resources, and depletion is defined at the rate of extraction which occurs over and above this replenishment level. If managed correctly, renewable resources can be harvested in perpetuity. In the real world, however, market incentives exist that often lead to the overexploitation and thus depletion of these resources. A related umbrella concept, degradation, considers changes in the capacity of environmental assets to deliver a broad range of ecosystem services and the extent to which this capacity may be reduced through the action of economic units. Examples of degradation include the declining condition of natural woodlands, which reduces the volume of both carbon sequestered and air pollution removed. Since depletion relates to one type of ecosystem service, it can be considered a specific form of degradation. Degradation is something we've not been able to estimate for due to the complexities inherent in attempting to discern how changes in the condition or extent of an ecosystem affect its ability to deliver flows of services over time. A multitude of factors can affect the functioning of an ecosystem habitat, and our definition of degradation only considers declines in the condition that were driven by human action. Determining exactly whether and how much of a change in ecosystem habitat condition was caused by human interaction is not trivial. And on top of this, degradation means that multiple ecosystem services are affected. and they all may be affected differently and not necessarily all negatively. Therefore, comprehensive modelling of all services is required, something again which is not simple. However, given the evidence of the extensive degradation of our natural environment, the monetary values of this could be extremely high. An example of this is soil degradation. We know that due to intensive agricultural practices, such as the application of high volumes of fertilizers and insecticides, the quality of soil has declined markedly. This translates into declining agricultural productivity, which often results in further application of these chemicals. This self-reinforcing spiral can only continue for so long, and ultimately the entire food system becomes increasingly more fragile as we erode and degrade our soil base. To give you an idea of the magnitude of this, Graves et al. In 2015 estimated the cost of soil degradation through loss of organic matter, soil compaction and erosion to be in the region of 1.2 billion in England and Wales. So why measure depletion? First of all, it is contained within the SEEA accounts, and an ambition of our natural capital and wider environmental accounting is to produce as much of the recommended central framework as possible, to give the most comprehensive idea of the environment, economy, and societal interactions. Linked to this is the upcoming System of National Accounts 2025 update, which looks to place greater emphasis on the importance of these satellite accounts and their potential for augmenting traditional economic metrics. An example of this is the derivation of net domestic product, an indicator which economists have for a long time agreed, in theory, provides a better overview of economic development. I'll provide an example of why this is important in the next slide. However, a long-standing problem with the derivation of NDP is a lack of robust data, traditionally on the consumption of fixed capital, however, most recently with depletion of our natural resources. The ONS has a strong agenda when it comes to going beyond GDP, moving towards inclusive wealth and income stances on economic measurement instruments. Lastly, depletion allows us to understand trade-offs between the expansion of production activities and a sustainable economy, forcing us to consider what is lost in the process of generating output, when traditional measures focus only on what we gain. For example, we could attempt to harvest all of our fish stocks in the UK's fishing zones, and doing so would boost GDP considerably. What this hides is the fact that by doing so, there will not be enough of a spawning stock biomass for future generations of fish, and therefore we limit our ability to benefit from this service in the future. Drawing out the Beyond GDP ONS agenda, some fantastic work in a previous ESCO paper done by some of my colleagues summarizes some of the well-recognized reasons for why GDP falls short. Failing to incorporate the value of unpaid household services, non-market ecosystem and abiotic natural services, environmental degradation, technological process and quality of public services. The Beyond GDP agenda builds on Descupta's idea of inclusive wealth by considering human and natural capital alongside manufactured capital. The ambition of this work is to provide a series of useful economic indicators which better reflects all of the important things in society which we value and contribute to our health, happiness, and standards of living. Lots of these alternative indicators already exist, and the decision over which metrics to incorporate can be subjective. However, in all cases, high-quality data is needed. Depletion is one of the more widely recognized and accepted metrics that the economic accounting community agree ought to be factored in, and the work I will present today will contribute to that effort. To illustrate the pros of considering NDP in conjunction with GDP, I've created two example graphs which map the economic trajectories of two countries with very different underlying economic characteristics. Country A is very reliant on industries which themselves are heavily dependent on the extraction and processing of natural materials. Country B is less so, instead being rooted more in service sector industries. The two graphs map their respective levels of GDP over time. In this example, both of them exhibit the same GDP between 2000 and 2012. However, for country A, when we factor in the monetized value of depletion, we can see that NDP drops significantly below GDP, whereas for country B, the two metrics remain convergent. So why is this important given that the GDP, a proxy used for the standards of living, is equivalent across the two? While a declining natural resource base for country A can limit its future productive capacity and ultimately impede the economy's ability to produce marketable output in the future. And this will manifest in future GDP, demonstrated by the dashed line on the chart. In comparison, country B, due to its industrial composition, is able to maintain its GDP growth better over time. And by 2018, there is considerable levels of divergence between the countries. By factoring in NDP at an earlier stage and comparing it to GDP, the sustainability of economic development is better understood, and this may have some important consequences for policymakers. An example of how policymakers in country A may look to address this through intervention is by diverting the rents made in the natural resource industries into other sectors which are more sustainable, such as the renewable energy industries. And this can help to enable economic growth over the longer term. This isn't always a simple job. Lots of the services provided by nature are hard to replicate, with limited options for substitution existing. Developments in technology can and have historically played an important role in shifting economies' dependencies. It is, however, not a given that more developed economies become less dependent on finite natural resources, and concerted government intervention is often required to alter the development path of industry. By way of a secondary part of the intro, I'd like to talk very briefly about our team's main deliverable, the UK Natural Capital Accounts, from which most of our other work typically springs, such as our habitat accounts, along with ecosystem service publications and these depletion accounts. Working in this space means we must identify the many ecosystem and abiotic services that UK Natural Capital provides to society. Devising methods to quantify the physical volume of these services and building on these economic methodologies to translate the diverse set of physical outputs into a common monetary standard encompasses the main body of our work. Currently, we measure 16 natural services, which we categorize as either provisioning, regulating, or cultural services. As an overarching high-level statistic, nature generated an estimated 47 billion annual value in 2021. When we consider nature's long-term potential to continue to deliver these natural services, we estimate that the asset value to be 1.5 trillion. I would argue that the usefulness of our accounts resides not necessarily in these aggregate figures, but rather the service, habitat, and geospatial breakdowns. The difficulty is also appreciating the methodology that sits behind each of our services and considering the wider context. To illustrate this, it isn't a foregone conclusion that increases in the monetary value of a service, such as fish provisioning, is always a good thing. This result requires picking apart a little bit. For example, the value may rise due to increases in the price of the resource. This may in turn arise because of increasing scarcity of fish stocks. We know that fish is a nutrient-rich food, with government health bodies recommending the inclusion of more fish in our diets. And increasing prices can stifle consumption levels. Therefore, results need careful interpretation. Next, I will move on to the theory underpinning depletion and related concepts. Firstly, I'd like to talk a bit about an essential monetary valuation technique called the resource rent calculation. This is the workhorse for the valuation of our provisioning services and subsequently is the backbone of our depletion estimates. The resource rent essentially relates to the surplus levels of profit generated in an industry which is highly reliant on the input of a natural resource. This may seem like a weird concept, but if we begin with the total profits made in an industry, or the gross operating surplus in national accounting speak, and we deduct an opportunity cost from this figure, we are left with the resource rent. In our accounts, we refer to the resource rent as the annual value as it is measured over the course of a year. The opportunity cost aims to quantify what the owners of the capital could have earned if they had leveraged their capital in some other industry or economic activity. The residual value or resource rent is the extra profit they were able to generate over and above what they could have earned elsewhere. This value is then attributed to the input of the natural resource. How do we then capitalize this to reflect that this ecosystem is going to continue to supply useful products and services into the future? The SEEA suggested approach is to employ the net present value method, which projects the resource rents over a suitable time span before discounting the values and collapsing them down into a single asset value figure. The greater the asset value, the greater the value of the flow of services the ecosystem provides over the longer term. With these preliminaries in place, let's move on to the calculation of depletion. The physical side of depletion for the non-renewables we focus on is easy. It's simply the physical volume of materials extracted in an accounting period. A balance sheet style approach is taken to consider the additive relationship which exists between the volume depleted in a single year and the remaining physical stock of a resource. In a very simplified case, the stocks at the end of the year equal the stocks at the beginning of the year minus however much was depleted. But in reality, the situation is more complicated due to the exploration and appraisal activities of businesses that operate in industries such as oil and gas. Substantial sums of money are invested in uncovering new stocks of commercially exploitable resources, and new information can lead to upward reappraisals of existing stocks. It is not uncommon to see that stocks can rise over time despite positive levels of depletion, and this will be borne out in some of our results later on. So how do we then translate this into monetary terms? Firstly, we need a unit price for the physical rates of depletion. SEEA suggests that we calculate what's called the price in situ, which is the value of each unit of reserve as it lays in the ground. The calculation of this is easy. It's simply the total asset value divided by the total physical remaining stock. The interpretation of this is slightly more difficult, because for oil and gas, the only services that we've been able to estimate monetary depletion values for, the asset value utilizes industry data on estimates of the future physical production profile. When we calculate an average price for each unit in the ground, this effectively assumes that each unit of reserve is extracted proportionally to all other future production. In reality, different deposits will be earmarked and prioritized according to a number of commercial factors, such as profitability and quality of product. This will influence which deposits are extracted first and therefore the future period of extraction. Deposits that are extracted in the near term should be discounted less and therefore worth more than deposits extracted in the longer term. Substantial industry data is needed in order to estimate this, and we only have access to aggregate industry level data, which is why we've adopted the approach of averaging things. Next, the monetary value of depletion is simply equal to the physical volume of depletion multiplied by this price in situ. This should be interpreted as the monetary opportunity cost of depleting now rather than in the future. E.g., you've made a certain amount of income in this period when you've produced it, but if you'd left it in the ground and only began depleting it from next year onwards, you would have earned this alternative depletion value. This does lead to some interesting results, which we will explore later, because it's not always a given that the income you earn now is greater than what you could have earned in the future, despite future incomes being subject to discounting. As with most estimates, the results are sensitive to assumptions which feed into the model parameters, such as the future production projections and discounting rates. Moving on to a key parallel concept. Other changes in stock is a term that we've coined to encompass all the other factors which may influence the levels of physical reserves other than depletion. These can have a positive or negative effect on reserve levels and include new discoveries, reappraisals, reclassifications, normal and catastrophic losses, and regeneration in the case of renewables. SEEA suggests that you should delineate between these various factors where possible. However, due to data limitations, this is not something we've been able to do. Instead, we measure the net effect and lump it into this other changes in stock variable. And just to emphasize, thus far, we've only been able to produce estimates for several non-renewable services, and so have avoided the need to consider rates of regeneration. The monetary valuation of the changes in stock is akin to depletion, in that it is the physical volume multiplied by the price in situ. Thus far, we've identified two factors which lead to changes in the physical reserve levels, which will translate into a change in monetary value of the asset over time. However, there is a final factor which doesn't relate to the physical reserves, but instead financial variables, and we dub this the price effect. The premise of this is that the asset value can shift dramatically each year, even if the physical reserves do not change. This is because the resource rents of the product change year on year due to changes in factors such as the market price of the product, the overall industry profitability, and in our methods, the bond yield and inflation rates also play a part. The application of the SEEA methods allows us to decompose the changes in the asset value into the depletion, the other changes in stock, and the price effect. The equation here stipulates how the changes in the asset value is a function of the quantity effect, the argument on the left-hand side, which considers both the depletion and other changes in stock, and the price effect on the right-hand side, which is calculated by multiplying the change in price by the quantity of reserves. Further details of the algebraic derivation of this can be found in our online article, as well as directly in SEEA. Moving on to the results section, which I'll report on a service basis. Beginning with coal, a service for which we've only generated estimates for the physical dimensions, we can see that there has been a marked decline in coal depletion, a drop of 96% since 2009. Other changes in stock add 390 million tons of oil equivalent between 2009 and 2022. Reserves increased by 12% between 2009 and 2022, which was due to other changes in stock exceeding depletion levels. Further work is required to unpick some of these results, particularly the increase in reserve levels, where data is drawn from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. The reason that we've not reported monetary estimates is due to the nature of the results. When applying the resource rent technique, we observe that monetary values are consistently negative across the time series, which is a result of the low industry profitability. In the context of depletion, this is a non-sensible result as it effectively suggests that depletion is adding to the value of the asset. Therefore, unless alternative means are developed for estimating the monetary value of this service, we have omitted reporting results. Negative resource rents are a problem recognized in SEEA, and there is much debate around how developing alternative methods to use. More limited than coal, for minerals and metals, we are only able to report on the physical rates of depletion, and we can see that peak depletion occurred in 2008 at 261 million tons. This declined by 19% in 2009, and then ranged between 190 and 218 million tons between 2009 and 2021, but overall stayed at broadly similar levels. The limiting factor with mineral and metal estimates was not having comprehensive reserve data. Without this, we weren't able to map reserve levels over time or derive other changes in stock. Minerals and metals are heterogeneous, and a considerable number of quarries exist with differing levels of reserves at each, all of them with their own uncertainties. Without physical reserve levels, we also weren't able to produce monetary estimates because the price in situ calculation requires this variable as a denominator. Zooming out, minerals and metals isn't a very big sector in the UK natural capital picture, and so any estimates will be small compared to oil and gas, which we move on to next. The story for oil and gas is very similar, and to save time, I will focus on oil. However, aggregate results for oil and gas are explored later. Depletion was consistently above 100 million tons of oil equivalent between 1982 to 2004, and peaked in 1999 at 150 million tons of oil equivalent. It has since declined to 41 million tons of oil equivalent in 2022. Other changes in stock are positive in 80% of years and added 3,967 million tons of oil equivalent to reserves over the entire time series. Depletion, however, is greater than other changes in stock in 61% of years, causing reserves to decline. Reserves did initially increase between 1974 and 1978, however declined to 1,014 million tons of oil equivalent in 2022, a 38% reduction since 1987. Moving on to the monetary results. Depletion rose from 3.5 billion in 1999 to its peak in 2008 at 9.8 billion, before diminishing to 2.5 billion in 2021. Other changes in stock added 137.1 billion to the asset value over the time series. The price effect is volatile but positive in most years, and between 1999 and 2021 added 46.4 billion to the value of the asset. A positive correlation of 0.3 exists between rates of physical and monetary depletion, which suggests the importance of the price effect, which is something I'll move on to now. In this slide, we've combined the monetary results of oil and gas and decomposed the change in the asset value into the three effects. We can see that on average, depletion accounts for 34% of the change, whilst the price effect accounts for 44% and the other changes in stock 22%. On the face of it, perhaps a slightly surprising result that depletion isn't the biggest factor here, but through an economic lens, it isn't. Prices and profitability are paramount in determining market outcomes, and those factors play an important role here too. In this final results slide, we look at the absolute levels of monetary depletion over time and compare it against the annual value or resource rent in the oil and gas industry. After deducting depletion from the annual value, we can see that it is 4.8 billion lower on average. In percentage terms, the annual value declines by 91% on average once you deduct depletion from it. In fact, the depletion adjusted annual value can fall into negative territory and does so in several years, including 2009 and 2014 to 2016. And this is a very interesting result. The root cause of this is that the price in situ, or the price used to value depletion, is declining at a slower rate than the resource rent. Or on the flip side, the resource rent is falling faster than the price in situ. The resource rent, as we explored earlier, is determined by financial circumstances in the accounting period. So if, say, industry profitability were to drop massively in 1 year, the resource rent would suffer a significant decline as well, all things being equal. The price in situ, on the other hand, is derived from the asset calculation, which employs averaged resource rents. So whilst the decline in the resource rent will have a negative impact on the price in situ, the averaging effect smooths this out. And this is exactly what we witnessed in those negative years. One possible way of interpreting these negative years is to say that the oil and gas producers would have in fact been better off delaying production in that year until the following year, where prices had recovered. This is of course simple and naive. Producers don't have perfect information and so can't judge exactly what prices will be in the future. That being said, we do know that the market structure of this industry permits producers to collude, limiting the production and raising the prices. So these results do reflect an interesting real-world characteristic of the industry. This, however, is well beyond the scope and purpose of the model. What we've mapped out here is one possible use of the depletion results. The annual value is itself a residual value of the industry profitability attributed to nature. And if we wanted to, we could deduct depletion from the gross value added of the industry, or even the entire economy's GDP to produce the likes of NDP. Finally, with these results now out, I move on to possible future developments. Whilst many possible avenues of further research exist, we are currently in a workstream prioritization process, which means that it is uncertain how much resource we will have to dedicate to the future of this project. That being said, if we are able to, then here are some of the things we'd like to build on. Producing estimates for more ecosystem and abiotic services would allow us to build a more comprehensive picture of the UK's natural resource depletion. This is important because when it comes to attempting to do things such as netting depletion off against the likes of GDP, if key natural resources are excluded, this may give the misconception that we aren't as reliant on natural resources as we actually are. That being said, oil and gas are very likely the natural resources for which depletion has the greatest monetary value in the UK. Secondly, and linked to the first point, renewable resources. Being able to estimate the rates of depletion for renewables would be a fantastic development. For non-renewables, the question is only how fast you deplete the resource. With renewables, the decision of extraction levels has critical consequences for the sustainability of the entire industry. And in order to do this, a better understanding of the rates of regeneration of the natural resource in question is required. Degradation. As mentioned at the start, degradation relates to the decline or extent, degradation relates to the decline in the condition or extent of an ecosystem and can have significant repercussions for its ability to provide continued flows of services. Estimating how environments have degraded and the extent that this is caused by humans before linking this to a reduced flow of services is a difficult and data-intensive task. Finally, who owns the depletion? SEEA suggests assigning depletion to an actor, such as the government or industry, and some apportionment techniques will be required to this end. And that's everything I have to talk to you about today. So thanks for listening, and I will now pass you on to Rachel from the US's Bureau of Economic Analysis.
Hi, everybody. I'll start. Okay, let me start screen sharing. I apologize for all tech issues. They're the fault of. Okay, it was working a minute ago. I'm sorry, everybody. I'm having a tiny bit of trouble sharing the screen, so I'll start talking. And the first thing, of course, I want to say is this is wonderful work, and I'm really excited to see, people doing this because it will help us understand the economy a lot better. Are people able to see my slides now?
Yeah, Rachel, that's come up. I can see it.
Good. So just first review the paper, though that's somewhat silly because he gave such a good presentation. And next, and this is maybe for people who are very expert national accountants, just explain how depletion relates to the other similar national accounting concepts. And so it's actually a very good concept because it's very less flexible. And finally, I have some suggestions, just sort of, to get it a little closer to how other countries use terminology. So just first, as he said, it discusses how it handles depletion and degradation. And he's very good about explaining why those concepts are so important. And I'm really excited for SNA 2025, because even though these measures are not so exciting for the UK because it's not a resource-based economy, his slides certainly showed economies that may really benefit from this type of thing. And also there's more natural resources that may be larger once we get good at measuring oil and gas. Maybe we can measure everything else. And here, I really like this graph. In general, the graphs were great. But this one, put everything together to help me understand that prices, are very volatile. Depletion is also volatile, but the other changes in stock is not so volatile. And just to understand where things are happening with the mineral industry. And a lot of people care about balance sheets, so knowing why things change is important. So now I just want to talk for people who have a little bit of background in national accounting. These are the various concepts we think about. So CFC is basically consumption of fixed capital. It's a consequence of investment in produced capital. And an oil well, at least in the United States, is considered a produced capital asset. And so what we do is GDP is gross, so it doesn't subtract CFC, but net domestic product, NDP, does. And so what you get is, if you look in the national accounts on the various tables, you can see both new investment and CFC, which is very useful for people who want to understand sort of what's happening in an industry. On a downside, at least the way most accountants do it, CFC is almost always smooth. And that means that sometimes when you have cyclical stuff happening in the economy, we sort of miss some of it because we assume a very smooth depreciation for capital. And then you have, on the other hand, inventory withdrawals. So inventory is a little bit different because it doesn't depreciate with age, but it is used up in production. And that means that real inventory withdrawals can be very volatile because in one year you might build up your inventories and another year you might take them down. But we don't really know so much about inventory because we just know here's the inventory at the beginning of the year, here's the inventory at the end of the year. And often companies don't report exactly how much they're adding and how much they're withdrawing. And the volatility can often be good because the volatility helps us sort of understand what's really happening with more production using more resources. But sometimes the volatility is really that they had a shock that wasn't quite large enough to be a disaster, but destroyed some inventory. And so depletion sort of seems in between. Like capital, it's not subtracted from GDP. But like inventory, it's very, you know, it's caused by usage and can be volatile. So one could argue depletion is, you know, the best of both worlds, which is a way wonderful. Depletion, you know, can give you the best picture of the economy if you have an ambiguous thing. You put in depletion. On the other hand, I'm jealous because I would like to have, you know, other things as flexible as depletion, to have, you know, all these different ways in which we can, you know, understand what's happening in the economy. So this is for national accountants. We should be jealous, and maybe someday we'll get more flexibility on all the others to give all this information that Aram has had to put together. And I salute his work putting together more stuff than every other, you know, category of using up assets takes. So here are my suggestions. Biggest suggestion I have is to think very hard about mineral exploration. And since I made that suggestion, he's done some research and he thinks that it's not such a big deal because of the way accounting for the mineral industry works in the UK, but it may still be an issue in other countries. The basic issue is we already have mineral exploration. And mineral exploration, you find a deposit of minerals. They don't like disappear on their own. They disappear because they get used up. And it looks, at least, the mineral exploration is much smaller and smoother than depletion. And I'm wondering why this is and what is exactly happening. But this is something that Aram has since looked into, and it seems to be okay for the UK. But just if the paper could eventually explain, you know, exactly how other countries can avoid the problems the UK is not having, because other countries may have different methods of measuring things. And another thing I want to think about, and this one is very tricky empirically, so it's easy for me to say, is just how do we actually value reserves? Because, of course, economic theory would suggest that just because something's not being produced now doesn't mean it doesn't have any value at any possible prices. If prices are flat, you know, for the rest of eternity, then it's simple because, you know, prices now in Aram's formula, you know, the production cost versus the output price will tell you the value of reserves. And once you get to have some amount of volatile prices, which is very common in the commodity industry, then you have to worry that, you know, some things come in and out of production. And so they have more value than you might think from their production costs in one snapshot year because they're an option value. And another thing you might want to worry about is sometimes when mining companies report is correctly, according to GAAP, that the reserves aren't there. They really are still there. They just aren't profitable. And so they're not there right. They're not in the production set right now. And so this matters because if you want to get price effects versus quantity effects, it's really hard to get them separate. The nominal numbers are often much easier. So just other stuff to think about is other changes in stock. It's as he said, their own concepts, and it's hard to relate it to all the S&A stuff. Some stuff is clearly, you know, one thing, but other stuff, I don't know what to do with it. Like, say, there's losses due to production that are not actually production. And sometimes this just happens with any type of production process, there's wastage. And so this wastage I would think of as basically a type of production, because you just can't have, you know, everything be perfect. There are mistakes. And also, like when the government says you can't mine there, I don't know if we should say the reserves disappeared. Maybe they just, you know, the government said these reserves are ours now for whatever environmental or national security reason. But the reserves didn't physically disappear, and they're not they're not impossible to produce. They just are not allowed to produce. So these are, you know, very hard things. They don't really affect GDP that much, because a lot of this is calling it, okay, price effects rather than volume effects, but neither the price nor the volume are in GDP. So this may be like a secondary thing if somebody just wants to focus on the national accounts, which of course are what get the most attention. So thank you so much for letting me talk, and I am going to hit escape now. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Sharing so that.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel.
Okay,
and
now.
Thank you very much to Aram for an excellent presentation. We've got a few questions. I'm just going to abuse my position and ask one very quick question first. If you're right, as I hope you are, that net concepts are going to be more important, that we'll concentrate more on net GDP than gross GDP in future, then the estimates we're going to have for depletion and so on are going to be much more timely. I mean, one of the reasons that GDP gets such a lot of attention is it's very timely. The net concepts we've got are actually relate to a few years ago. So I was a bit surprised that there wasn't more in the work program or the prioritization list about getting more timely information. I just wondered if you've got much to say about that.
I mean, that's a fantastic point, Joe. Yeah, absolutely right in terms of the utility around, you know, for the key stakeholders, key users of GDP, the timeliness is a very key consideration, and it's something that we've very much struggled in the natural capital space in terms of typically when we produce our accounts, the latest year for which we have data is usually 2 years before. So, and you know, we'll produce our 2024 estimates later this year, and it'll be backdated to 2022. Obviously, that's not ideal, right? You want as timely data as possible, but you know, the natural capital counts are built off a multitude of separate data sources. Each of them have their own delays, and piling it all together is something that often leads to that those types of data limitations. Now, that being said, I think yes, that is something very important to consider, and no doubt there are methods that can be devised in order to project that forward so that it is more timely. I mean, whether you can do it, say, quarterly, or even kind of less than that is something that I think that requires a kind of an in-depth look into, but it would present its own challenges. And I think, Joe, the interesting thing at the moment is we are kind of in a position where we put these numbers out there. There are now depletion estimates or monetary depletion estimates for oil and gas. It's kind of now up to kind of more senior economists at the ONS and such in order to decide on how exactly this is used in the likes of, you know, netting off depletion from GDP. But yeah, absolutely. I imagine that's a very valid consideration, in that in order to do that and to do it robustly, you'd want to make it more timely, and that's the key challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. Zusa, you had a question? Would you like to put your question? No, we're not getting contact. Shall I read your question out, Issa2? Would that make sense? Issa2 says, what specific contribution can private investments make towards securing the goal of natural recovery? And then a bit more specifically, I think, problems relating to the protection of natural capital include the inability of economics to appropriately model and price both market and non-market environmental resources, lack of willingness to pay, lack of knowledge about minimum levels or time spans required for resources to replenish or renew, lack of knowledge regarding the interaction and dependencies between resources and their true value, usefulness or necessity, poor management of transboundary sources, and inequalities between developed and developed and developing nations. So quite a lot of issues there about why this is difficult.
Yeah.
Either Aram or Rachel, do you have anything to say to that?
I can jump in, Rachel, and then if there's anything you want to add on afterwards, yeah. I mean, these are all fantastically, poignant points that you've raised about all of this, right? I guess we see depletion as one of the attempts at monetizing the thing that's not being monetized at the moment in order to be able to incorporate it into our decisions on a common basis to all the other market driven decisions that we're making. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, basic economic modeling stipulates that private cost benefits may not equal to social costs and benefits. The likes of pollution, wastage, all the kind of tertiary impacts of consumption and production obviously have a big impact on people who are not directly involved in that transaction. And it's very much a part of the ONS agenda to begin scoping out and beginning to try and monetize these things so that you can bring everything on kind of a level playing field and make sure you have access to all the information that you'd want in order to attempt to identify what the optimal level of consumption production is. Obviously, this is a theoretical thing. Data on the marginal costs of production and the marginal social benefits is very difficult to kind of quantify. But if you don't, then you're going to kind of witness market outcomes which I think intuitively we know aren't ideal, right? I think most of us can look around at the state of the natural world and be like, yeah, things obviously aren't ideal. Things aren't being incorporated, which they should be, and that's a problem, and it's something that needs to be addressed. Just looking at some of the other points, lack of data on the rates at which some of our natural resources replenished. Absolutely, that is totally something which, although I'm not an expert on, I've been working with some of the institutions which look to kind of model rates of sustainable yields. Obviously, in regards to fish stocks, and as you can imagine, estimating how many fish there are out there and the rates at which they regenerate is a very complicated thing. And to some extent, at the ONS, our hands are kind of bound because we're not experts in this field, but we're looking to draw data from them, and that's why it's very much a two-way thing. We engage with them, look to see what's what's possible, and then feed it into our stuff. But yeah, absolutely valid point about the uncertainties inherent in some of these things that you're looking to quantify. I also, sorry, Rachel, can you come in?
I just wanted to defend your work. You're absolutely right. There are always uncertainties and your numbers are not perfect. But I've seen so many other parts of the GDP that have much worse uncertainties and had to make more, unfounded assumptions, that I see something where you have actual gallons extracted and a really well-founded price. That's like puts me, I think your numbers are a lot better than numbers people are used to just using because they've been uncertain, but they're done the same way for decades.
That's very kind, Rachel. Thank you. And I guess I think just because I had another point, which was about there was something to do with, I think, global natural resource depletion, or maybe that was someone else. But anyway, I think I responded. I typed an answer. I put a link to this website called Commodity Footprint. So within our depletion estimates, we only consider depletion that's occurring within the UK's exclusive economic zone, and not any of the natural resource depletion that results from UK consumption from products which are imported. And as you can imagine, the UK does import a lot of products from abroad. So what this dashboard does is you can visualize and pull data on some of the variables are associated with natural resource depletion associated with UK consumption as well as production. So yeah, I'd point people in that direction, and just note that that's not something we consider in these depletion estimates thus far.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I do very much appreciate Rachel's point. It's very easy in these cases to generate a kind of impossibility theorem because of all of the issues and difficulties around. I think if that had been the case, GDP and the national accounts would probably never have been developed in the early stages. So upwards and onwards, I think, is the message. There's a question from Michael Lyon. Michael, would you like to put your point?
Thanks, Joe, and Adam and Rachel. Well, I typed out the question, but I'm trying to form an intuitive understanding of what those data in oil and gas and coal on other changes in reserves imply. And it is always appropriate to identify this concept of depletion. That's basically my question.
Yeah.
If I could offer a sort of stupid example, what about the industry of harvesting salt from sea salt? That resource is effectively infinite. So it wouldn't make any sense to deploy the concept of depletion estimates and so forth for that. And therefore, yeah, so I was wondering in what circumstances is this concept a sensible, practical one to use?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Michael. I guess I just on the last point for the case of harvesting salt from the sea. Not my area of expertise, but I think you touched on it. That's something that we are very unlikely to ever deplete the sea of completely. In which case, the concept of depletion just very simply wouldn't apply to it. And I think it's much in the same case as like the harvesting of sunlight in order to produce solar energy is something I think it'll be impossible for us to essentially overtake. So again, depletion wouldn't be relevant. I think for renewables, typically that are affected by depletion is typically the likes of fish, timber, etc., where there is rates of regeneration, but human economic intervention is at such a level that we are threatening the continued kind of existence of this resource, and that's where it's more applicable. Now, I think just the first part, there's a really interesting thing of where I've mapped the reserve levels over time of, say, the oil and gas industry. This is a kind of a simple derivation of what we think the commercially exploitable reserves of oil and gas are likely to be. Now, implicit within that is information about how do the prices and the commercial factors and government policy, how is that likely to change over the course of the future? Now, we work with industry experts at the North Sea Transition Authority who use their kind of domain-specific knowledge in order to estimate, okay, well, we think it's this fraction of all the reserves that we know about is going to be commercially exploited. Now, I think Rachel is kind of touched upon it in her presentation. That is only a fraction of the total level of physical deposits which exist in the real world underground in the North Sea, right? So the uncertainties again inherent in kind of recognizing that, well, the commercial environment changes, the technological environment changes. How much of an impact is the renewable energy sector going to have on making oil and gas redundant? Again, open question. No one truly knows. But we've worked with the North Sea Transition Authority in order to define what the categories of reserves are that we use, because if you have a look at both our publication as well as the North Sea Transition Authority website, they stratify the reserves according to a number of categories based on the likelihood that it's going to be commercially exploitable. Now, for our purposes, we need to derive a single metric over the course of the time series. And so we kind of, we took a few of the categories where we thought the probability was high enough and then excluded a few others. And that is going to manifest in the price, the monetary value of depletion. Now, I think, again, just in terms of how well defined the concept of depletion is, I would argue it's pretty well defined. I mean, in the case of non-renewables, it's very easy, right? However much you take, there's that much less of it in the future. Now, for renewables, it's slightly more tricky because that perfect level of depletion is or perfectly identifying that level of depletion is difficult because of, say, some of the uncertainties around, well, how much is the stock actually regenerating, what is the maximal sustainable yield, etc.
Okay. Anything to add, Rachel? Sorry, Michael, go ahead.
I'm just going to, if I could follow up, I'm just concerned that isn't there a kind of a resource-specific judgment to be made? Sea salt is a physical resource just as oil is, so that can't be the logic at play. It seems to be. I just wonder if there's a criterion or a test that's required to establish whether, in some kind of economic or practical sense, the concept of depletion in a circumstance is a useful one to be pursuing, or whether it's not a relevant one.
Rachel, do you want to come back on that, or because I can get back on it?
Sure. I would say that this is something where we can actually rely on the market to help, because the value of sea salt is a lot less than the production cost of salt from the ocean. So right now, the implicit value of sort of the salt in the sea in an economic sense is near zero. So it's not worth Aram's careful attention, because every single thing he studies, I know how much data work goes into those few clean looking graphs. And so we can sort of focus our attention on the reserves the market tells us are the most important, and then maybe move from there.
I guess just to add to that, Michael, the key, you know, we've got the algebra in the publication, but the key, you know, kind of equation that you can apply to all these separate things to determine whether or not resource depletion is occurring is whether the rate of extraction is exceeding the levels of regeneration. So for sea salt, I guess, you know, X amount of new salt is created in the sea. Again, I'm not an expert, so I don't know entirely, but I'd imagine that that's the case, right? New salt is made available. You take a certain amount out, and it's only the extent to which you take it out exceeds the level at which it's able to regenerate, and then you've got a decline in the stock of salt in the sea.
Okay. Well,
Okay, thanks.
I think. Sorry, Michael. One last coming back. We should finish in a moment, but
I was just saying thank you. Thanks very much, Joe and Aram.
Well, thank you very much. Excellent question. I think we're nearly out of time. I can't see any more questions. So I think it probably just remains for me to thank Aram and Rachel, and thank everyone also for attending. It's confirmed in my mind this is a really important area, and I look forward actually to the ongoing agenda. I might just say, by way of advertisement, that this area is one of ESCO's biggest items of work. So we look forward to working with ONS and with others to take this forward. But otherwise, I think we're virtually out of time. So just thank you very much, and I hope people in the UK have a nice lunch, and people elsewhere also have a nice lunch whenever. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you
indeed.
so much. Cheers, everyone.